folks, this is Tanner Reid, Product Design Evangelist at Autodesk, and today I'm going to be taking you through the design process of creating this tufted headboard. So you've got three basic components here. We've got this metal frame, a tufted panel that goes inside of it, as well as a circular mirror that goes on the top. I've gone ahead and created a sketch and piping for this outside profile. There's plenty of resources online of how to do that, so I didn't want to kind of drag you through something that you already know. So instead we're going to be focusing on how to actually create this tufted panel inside of it. But I will take you through the process of how I made this outside frame. So I started in Fusion with a model of a bed. This isn't necessary to design this, obviously. You can design it without it. But I knew that I was going to be rendering it later, so I might as well go ahead and put the bed in, because that gave me the opportunity to design around these pillows that were here. So I could make sure that my headboard was tall enough and kind of frame them so they wouldn't get lost behind the bed once it's made. So the first thing I did was I right-clicked on the full file over here and said New Component, and that gave me what you see here as Component 2. And once that was there, I could activate that component. And in that, I created a sketch. And let's see if we can show that sketch. There we go. And I created that sketch right here on the back surface of this mattress. And when I created that, I used something called the Project tool. If you haven't used it before, super cool tool. You can go to Sketch, go to Project Include, and say Project. And it basically lets you choose any particular body and project the profile of that body onto your current sketch. So I'm going to hide my bed here real quick so you can see. I clicked on the two pillows as well as the two mattresses, and it projected their profiles into my sketch so that I could then design around them. So once I had that, I went in here and drew out the one side of my frame. And once I had that finished, I was able to come in and use the Pipe tool in Fusion, so that's under Create and Pipe, to click on the individual segments and make those segments into a square tube with a 2-inch section around it. So if I come back, I can show you an example of that. This is the Pipe tool that I used for the first profile. So I clicked on that line, made the pipe around it, made sure it was square and had a new body, and I made the section size 2-inch and said OK. For the other ones that I put around, I just made sure that was a join command instead of a new body. And then I just mirrored the entire side about this face right here. And I combined them together to make them into one body. So that's how I made the frame. Pretty simple. You can make this whatever shape you want. I gave sort of like a classic kind of tall, concave sort of shape. You can make whatever you'd like. The tufting kind of comes in after that. So the next thing I'm going to do is take us into the tufting mode, or the sculpting mode to make the tufting. I'm going to hide my sketch that I had here originally, but I'm going to keep this frame visible. So what I'm going to do now is show us on the front view and go to Create, and I'm going to choose Create Form. When I choose this, it's going to bring me into the sculpting environment, and in here I'm going to start with a plane. So under Create, it's the second one down, it says Plane. And I'm going to begin on a certain plane to create this. So I'm going to choose this profile that's the front face of the frame that we've made with the Pipe tool. So that's going to put me on that plane. And there's a few ways to start my T-spline plane that I'm making. So I can either do it with a centered point or a 2-point. Make sure you choose 2-point because that lets me snap to the inside corner of this frame that we've made. And I can bring it over to fill up the entire inside width. So if I look down here at the bottom dimension there, that's 58 inches. So I'm going to make sure that that is 58. And I want the height to also be 58. And that's because I want my pattern of tufts, of buttons, to be square. So I want to make sure they're equidistant apart from each other. And going ahead and making this plane that same square proportion is going to be the easiest way to do that. So I just hit Tab to go between them, and Fusion exited out so that I was put into the actual plane mode. And on here now I can go in and define the number of spaces that I want to go across. So if you look here, let's see, this is about the spacing that I want for my tufting buttons. So I want to have, let's go a little bit more, let's see, something more like that. So the key here is that each of these needs to be divisible by 4. And the reason for that is because we want to have space for the tufting to get pinched in, as well as come back up and leave a flat surface in between them. And you'll see how that works in a minute. But I'm going to start off with 24 on this side and 24 on this side. And again, that's going to give us a square proportion, and it's going to give us a good amount of faces that we can make 4 spaced between each other. So in here, I'm going to go ahead and choose a mirror that's not length. I want to do width instead, and say OK. Now, once we have that plane here, all we have to do is go in and pick the points that we want to tuft in, and we want to move them back. Or actually, the first thing I'm going to do is go over to Select, and I'm going to choose my selection filters. And I'm going to say, I'm going to deselect Select All, and I'm going to choose T-Spline Vertices. This will make it a little bit easier to click on the buttons that we want. And I'm going to pick the different points that I want to punch in for buttons on my tufting. But you want to make sure that no matter which ones you choose, they are 4 squares apart. I've also found that 3 squares apart works as well, but 4 I think really looks the best. So once we have that, I'm going to go in and say Edit Form. And I'm going to look at the side here. And I'm going to click on the arrow that moves them in and out away from the surface. And I'm going to pull it back 2 inches. And say OK. Now if I spin back around, you can definitely see the start of our tufting, but it also looks very bubbly. So it's very smooth and weird. It's nothing that tufting would look like. So the first thing we can do to try to combat that is to crease any of the edges that go in, that cross over the tufting points. So I'm going to go to Modify and choose Crease. And I'm just going to select the T-spline edges. So I'm holding down Shift. The T-spline edges that cross through these tufted buttons. And you'll see the effect of that once it creases. There we go. And then we'll say OK. And now if you look, it's a little bit better. We're getting a little bit more of a crease in fabric that you would expect with tufting. But if we hide our edges there, so let's just go to Shaded, you can see they're still a little bit weird. They're still a little bit rounded, and it's all just a little bit too bubbled and smooth. So the next thing that we're going to try to do is move those creased edges back a little bit. And you'll see that that'll give us more of a pinched off fabric kind of look. So I'm going to double click on each of these lines. But first, got to change my selection filters back to T-spline edges. And then I'm going to double click on any of the lines that run through these tufting. So any of the lines that we've creased. I'm going to say Modify, Edit Form, and on this side I'm going to move these back as well, but I'm not going to go back the full 2 inches. I want to go back less than that. So I'm going to just go back in 1/2 inch and say OK. And this now you should really start to see it look like a tufted material. So if I go back in now and just show Shaded, we can really start to see that, that folded fabric pattern going into it. And once we have that, we're finished. So I can say Finish the Form. And now you can get a pretty good sense of what that tufting is going to look like on the frame. And so the next thing we have to do is trim off this extra space before we start making this into a 3D object. So I'm just going to make sure that we're still working in Component 2 here. And then I'm going to go to the Patch environment. And in the Patch environment, I'm going to use the Extrude tool to pull out a surface that we can use to chop off this extra space. So if I go to Create, I can say Extrude, and I'm going to pick this back surface of the piped frame that we created earlier. If I click that, I can drag it forward in space, and if you look at what that's doing, it's just pulling out the edges that we have from that profile and making surfaces out of them. So then I can say OK. Now the next thing I want to do is get rid of the extra surfaces that we don't need. So we don't need the outside piece, we only need the inside one. We don't need this circle, and we don't need this square down here. So I'm going to go and open up my bodies, and I'm going to choose that outside piece, that circular piece, and that bottom square piece. I'm going to right click it, and then I'm going to say remove. So now you should only have just the frame. The body that we sculpted, I'm going to call that tufting. And the body that's going to cut it, I'm going to call that the cutter. Now before we cut it, I'm going to hide the frame. I'm going to name that frame real quick. I'm going to hide the frame, and I'm going to hide the cutter. And what I want to do is go into Modify and choose Extend. So what this is going to do is basically make sure that all of my edges of this sculpted body extend beyond that cutter that we made. So if you remember, when you're sculpting, it's not parametric. It wasn't linked to the frame that we made. So we don't know if it even crosses over completely. So by adding an extra inch around the entire thing, that just ensures that all of it crosses through that cutter. So if you look here, you can see that that every part of the frame, or every part of the tufting, goes away from the cutter. So next, we're going to go to Modify, and I'm going to choose Split Body. When I do that, I'm going to choose that back sculpted piece. For the tool, I'm going to choose our cutter, and I'm going to extend the tool just to make sure that we go all the way through, and say OK. And now you'll see we have two tufting, and the second one is just that outside extra piece, so I can click it and say Remove. And then if I hide my cutter and show my frame, there you'll see we've got our tufting cut to shape and size for the frame that we made earlier. So the next thing I want to do is move this tufting out away from the frame to the point that we want it to be in the actual model. So like this is, I guess, how puffy it is, how much padding you want behind you when you're leaning against it. So I'm going to click on Tufting in the browser, and I'm going to right click and say Move. And then I'm going to choose how far away I want to go. I think 2 inches is probably reasonable. You can make it whatever thickness you want there, but 2 is good for me. I'll say OK. And now essentially what I want to do is make that solid all the way to the back of this frame so that it fills in that volume. If you haven't used the boundary fill tool before, it's an incredible tool. That's what I'm going to use to make this. And it basically lets you pick different boundaries and fill in sort of like a mold. So if I show my cutter there and hide my frame, you can see there where it makes sort of like a bowl that you could fill something in with. But I need a top to stop that filling. And right now, we don't really have a plane that defines that. So under Construct, I'm just going to say Plane through 3 points. And I'm going to choose 3 of the points on my cutter. It says here that my object isn't visible, so I'm just going to make sure that my constructions are showing. And there you can see that construction plane that we created. So if I go back into the modeling environment, under Create, I can choose Boundary Fill. And it's going to ask me to pick my tools that I'm going to use to be the mold to fill this in with. So the first one is going to be this sculpted body here that we've made, the tufting. The second one will be the cutter. And the third one will be that construction plane that we made. That's going to cap it off. And whenever you're using the boundary fill tool, as soon as you have a fillable volume, Fusion's going to make that green for you so that you know. And then when you click on Select Cells, you can choose that volume. There might be multiple volumes depending on what parameters you give it. We only had one viable volume between these 3, so I've got one option. And then I can say OK. Once I've done that, I'm going to hide my tufting and cutting surfaces, and that's going to leave just my tufted board there. And the next thing I want to do to it is fillet the edges to make it kind of puffy around the sides. So I'm going to go to Modify and choose Fillet, if I can find it. There it is. And I'm going to pick all of the edges going around. The reason I'm not doing a window select for this is that I don't want to crease those creased edges that go along the inside. And we can hide that construction there. And that's good. Then I'm going to choose 1.5 inches. Again, the puffiness of this is your choice. I like the 1.5 though. I think it's a pretty smooth transition. Let's get a look and make sure that looks good. Yeah, like that. That'll be good. Say OK. And now if we show our frame, you can see our tufted body that goes in there padded for the headboard. So now what I'm going to do is choose Appearances. It's under the Modify menu. And on that, I'm going to go to leather and cloth, choose cloth, and choose green fabric. Now the last thing that we want to do, not the last, but next to last, is make these buttons to go inside of it. So I'm going to go in and create a sketch, and I'm going to choose this front face of the frame. And when you do that, you'll see where our tufting has kind of gone in back behind the frame, because you can see that, that orange sketch plane crossing through it. And that's where I want to create my buttons. So I'm going to go over here to Center Diameter Circle. It's under Sketch, Circle, and Center Diameter Circle. And I'm going to click on that point where those two crease edges cross. And I'm going to bring that out to be 2 inches. Once I have that, I can hit Stop Sketch. And I'm just going to center about that a little bit and choose the Extrude tool. Now on that, I can click it and bring it out 0.5 inches. I just want to make sure that this says New Body rather than Cut. And say OK. Then we can go to Modify and say Fillet. Choose that outside edge and give it a, maybe a 0.25 inch fillet. And say OK. Now I'm just going to check my edges, and that looks good. We can see it's kind of tucked back in there, and when you're modeling now, it's important to know that these have crossovers, right? Like this button is actually going into the tufting on either side, which, obviously could cause some problems in terms of like prototyping or 3D printing this. But with these tufted headboards, obviously, there's not a lot of specific value that comes into making sure that things don't overlap. And that's because, you're going to be designing this as one cut piece of filler and then stretching fabric over it. So these buttons and these tufting and everything is really just for visual sake. It's to render and get the product concept out. So it's okay if we have a little bit of overlap. It's actually going to make it look really nice, like it's punched into the fabric there. So don't worry too much about that. Finally, we're going to go to Create and say Pattern, and we'll choose Rectangular Pattern. And the pattern type, make sure you choose bodies here so that we get the entire button. And then I want to choose my direction, so I'm going to choose a horizontal there. And I'm going to drag this out to align over the last piece. And to do that, it's not going to be quite exact, so I'm going to do -38.5. Let's see if that, you go over a little bit more, 0.75. Yeah, that looks good. Then I'm going to choose 5 buttons for that row. And then I'm going to move up a column here, and I'm going to make this 19.5. Let's see how that looks. Maybe 0.25. There we go. And 3 is good. That lines up. Say OK. And now I've got all of my buttons. But if you remember, we've got a couple of extra ones that are here and here. They're back behind that. So I'm going to go in my browser and hover over these to see which ones they are. They're 72 and 76. So I can right-click on those and say Remove. And it looks like I forgot to make my button fabric green before I patterned it, so I'm just going to select all of those and type in A. That's going to shortcut to the Appearance window, and I'm going to drag fabric green onto those buttons. Then I'll hit Close, and now our buttons are finished. The last thing I want to do is create the mirror that's going to go in this circle up here. Which is a pretty quick process. I'm just going to create a sketch on that front face of the frame, and then I'm going to stop the sketch. And that just gave me a sketch profile that I can use to extrude out the center of that to make the mirror. So I'm going to go in -0.5 inches, and I'm going to make sure the operation is a new body. Say OK. And then I'm going to hit M. That's going to be the shortcut for Move. I'm going to move it back 1 inch. And Move, by the way, is under Modify if you don't use the shortcuts there. Now I want to just chamfer the outside edge of this mirror. And I want to do it at 2 distances. So I want to be able to go back 0.5 inches. And I want to be able to come in 1.5 inches. And that'll give me the mirror that goes there in the middle. So finally, I'm going to go back to my appearances. And under Metal, I'm just going to choose Chrome and say Close. And that's the finished headboard. Now one thing to note about this is that if I go into render here, you can kind of see the final effect. This that we've designed right now is assuming a fabric that has a stretchiness to it. And that's because we've made creases here to kind of bring in some tightness, but we still have sort of a a continuous surface going across it. So I'm going to stop the ray tracing for a minute and show you how to make one that has a fabric that has no give. So if you've got something like a cotton sheet that won't stretch, it'll have to fold over itself to make these tufts. We can make that happen too. So I'm just going to hide all of my buttons, and I'm going to go up to Create and choose Pipe. And I'm going to choose on this, click on this creased edge that goes through the tufting there. Make sure it's square, and I'm going to make the section size 0.2 inches. And then we're going to say, make sure it's cut, and then say OK. And then if I show these buttons again, we can go to the render space, and you'll see that that pipe cut into it just enough to make a kind of harsh edge there that simulates the fabric folding over itself. So when you make these tufts, you'll have to have that fabric with no give tuck in underneath itself to go down in between them. And this is a way to simulate that visually, instead of having to go and like sculpt all the different folds and stuff. So once you do that to all of those edges that we have there, you'll end up with something like this, where we have a little bit of a harsher tufting going on there. And that's it. And you know what? Bonus points if you make a entire room out of it. So this is an example of making a tufted headboard, tufted footboard, a tufted bench to go at the end of the bed, as well as a tufted chair to match. So you can kind of go crazy, have a lot of fun with it, and see where it goes from there. All right, everybody, thanks for joining. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section or tweet me at Tanner Reid. And if you're looking for more tutorial videos, they've got tons of them on the Fusion 360 page. You can see a couple over here on the left. And be sure to subscribe to the Fusion 360 YouTube channel. Thanks again, everybody.